What if the person standing at the altar with you was never really the one you wanted, and you knew that somewhere deep inside, even before you said yes? Not in the dramatic way it sounds when you say it out loud, not a sudden realization on the wedding day, not a moment of cold panic right before the ceremony. Something quieter than that. A low hum of doubt that you kept turning down, the way you turn down music that makes you feel things you don't want to feel. A recurring thought you dismissed as nerves, as immaturity, as fear of commitment. You told yourself everyone feels this way. You told yourself love is a choice, not a feeling. You told yourself that what you had was real enough, stable enough, safe enough, and that wanting more than that was probably just the movies talking. But the doubt didn't disappear. It just got buried under a wedding registry and a shared lease and the relentless forward motion of a life that had already been decided. And the question that nobody in your circle ever asked, the question that felt too dangerous to ask yourself, was this: why did you go through with it? Not out of cruelty, not out of manipulation, but out of something far more psychologically complex than simple dishonesty. Because the people who marry someone they don't love are not, for the most part, cold or calculating. They are people who are, in very specific and very human ways, afraid. And that fear has a structure to it, a pattern that plays out quietly across millions of relationships that most people never fully understand, even the ones living inside it. And if any part of what you just heard landed somewhere uncomfortable, that's not an accident. That discomfort is pointing at something worth looking at. Here is the honest truth about love and marriage that almost no one says clearly. Choosing a partner is rarely a purely emotional act. It is also, and perhaps more often than we admit, a psychological survival strategy. When we talk about people who marry someone they don't love, we are not talking about people who feel nothing. We are talking about people who have, somewhere along the way, learned to separate what they feel from what they choose. People who have become so skilled at managing their inner world, at suppressing longing, at rationalizing hesitation, at convincing themselves that what they have is what they deserve, that by the time they say "I do," they have almost genuinely talked themselves into believing it. This is what psychologists sometimes call emotional detachment in relational decision-making. But the clinical language doesn't capture what it actually feels like from the inside. From the inside, it feels like being practical. It feels like being mature. It feels like finally growing up and accepting that love is not a fairy tale. It feels like making a responsible choice for your future, for your family, for the version of yourself that has been waiting for stability your whole life. And sometimes it is all of those things. But sometimes, more often than we are comfortable acknowledging, it is also a quiet form of self-abandonment dressed up as wisdom. The concept at the center of this video is what we might call loveless bonding, the psychological and social forces that lead people to commit to a partner they do not deeply love, and the interior landscape of the person who makes that choice. Not the choice in a single moment, but the long, layered process, the years of conditioning, the accumulated fears, the subtle and not so subtle pressures that make that choice feel not just reasonable, but inevitable. You may be watching this because you recognize yourself in it. You may be watching because you recognize someone you love in it. Either way, what follows is for you. In this video, we are going to explore 7 psychological patterns that explain why people marry someone they don't love, and more importantly, what each of those patterns reveals about the inner world of the person living them. We will move from the most common and surface level to the deepest and most hidden. By the end, you will have a psychological map of something that usually stays invisible, not because people are lying, but because they are human in all the most complicated ways. Stay with this until the end. The ones toward the bottom of the list are the ones that tend to hit hardest. 1. The fear of being alone. The most immediate and the most widely recognized pattern is also the one most people are quickest to dismiss in themselves because it sounds so simple. Who would marry someone out of fear of loneliness? And yet the psychological reality of this fear is far more sophisticated than it appears on the surface. What we are really talking about here is not the fear of a quiet apartment or a Friday night without plans. We are talking about autophobia in its deeper relational form, the terror of being fundamentally unchoosable.
The internal belief, often formed in childhood and reinforced over years, that if no one is choosing you, it means no one ever will. That each year that passes without a committed relationship is not just circumstance, but evidence. Evidence of something wrong with you, something unlovable, something that will eventually be confirmed. When that belief is running in the background, a partner who is good enough becomes, psychologically, a life raft. Not because you love them, but because their presence quiets the terror. Their choosing you is proof that you can be chosen. And the prospect of releasing them, of going back to the uncertainty, back to the waiting, back to the silent verdict of another year alone, feels not just uncomfortable, but genuinely unbearable. This is why people in this pattern often know, somewhere beneath the surface, that what they feel is not quite love. But they also know that leaving would mean facing something they have been running from for a very long time. And the marriage, in its own quiet way, is the running. 2. Performing the expected life. There is a version of life that exists in other people's minds before it exists in yours. Your parents have a vision of who you will be. Your culture has a timeline. Your peer group sends signals through weddings and baby showers and casual questions at family dinners that mark where you are supposed to be and how far you are falling behind. And for a significant number of people, the decision to marry is less a choice they make and more a script they follow. Not because they were forced, not because they were naive, but because the accumulated social pressure of belonging to a family, a community, a cultural narrative, the pressure to be normal, to be acceptable, to not be the one who turned out differently, is a force that operates below conscious awareness in ways that are genuinely difficult to resist. The psychology here involves what researchers call external locus of identity, the construction of a self-concept that is built primarily around the expectations and approval of others. When your sense of who you are depends heavily on whether others see your life as legitimate and successful, the desire to marry someone you love can quietly be overridden by the more urgent need to marry someone who fits, someone who makes sense to your family, someone whose presence makes your life legible to the people whose approval you have always needed. The person living this pattern often does not experience it as performance. They experience it as making everyone happy. And in a world that has consistently told them that their happiness and the happiness of the people they love are the same thing, making everyone happy feels indistinguishable from living your own life. 3. Mistaking gratitude for love. This pattern is one of the most psychologically subtle and one of the most common. It begins with someone who has never been treated particularly well, in past relationships, in their family of origin, or both. Someone who has experienced neglect, inconsistency, or the low-grade damage of being with people who did not really see them. And then into that landscape comes a person who is kind. Not extraordinary, not electrifying, just genuinely kind. Someone who shows up, someone who follows through, someone who is patient and present and doesn't make everything difficult. And for someone who has spent years navigating relationships where basic reliability was a luxury, this kindness produces an emotional response that can be almost overwhelming. The problem is that what they are feeling is not love, or not love in its fullest sense. What they are feeling is relief, the deep, physical, neurological relief of finally not having to brace for impact. And because relief in close relationships is a genuinely rare and precious thing, because it produces warmth and gratitude and a desire to stay near the person creating it, it is very easy to interpret as love, to call it love, to build a life around it, and call that building a choice made from the heart.
The gratitude is real. The affection is real. The comfort is real. But there is a difference between loving someone and being grateful to them, and that difference tends to become visible over time in the quiet spaces of a long marriage, when the relief has settled into the ordinary, and the question of whether you actually chose this person or just stopped running begins to surface. 4. The belief that romantic love is not real. Some people do not marry without love because they are afraid, or because they are conforming, or because they have mistaken gratitude for something deeper. Some people marry without love because they have genuinely stopped believing that love, the kind worth waiting for, the kind that changes you, exists. This is the cynicism pattern, and it is almost always earned. It comes from watching a parent's marriage collapse, from loving someone fully and being left or betrayed, from the accumulation of romantic experiences that began with hope and ended with the same recognizable disappointment enough times that the brain, which is fundamentally a pattern recognition machine, begins to draw a conclusion. This doesn't happen, or it doesn't last, or it doesn't happen for people like me. The decision to marry someone you don't love, operating from this place, is not resignation in the way we usually imagine it. It is a kind of hard-won pragmatism, a settling that has been reframed with genuine intellectual conviction as wisdom. You have stopped chasing the feeling because you have decided the feeling was never a reliable foundation in the first place. What matters now is compatibility, shared values, stability, someone who will not leave. The emotional dimension has been quietly archived. What makes this pattern particularly difficult to recognize from the inside is that it is almost always accompanied by a coherent philosophical framework. The person can articulate clearly and persuasively exactly why they believe what they believe about love. The argument sounds reasonable. It often is reasonable, at least in part. But beneath the argument, if you look carefully, there is usually a wound that was never fully processed, a grief that got converted into a worldview, a broken heart that became a broken belief. 5. Using marriage as an escape route. This is a darker and less comfortable to discuss, but it is real, and it affects more people than the public conversation about marriage typically acknowledges. For some people, the marriage is not primarily about the partner at all. It is about getting out of a family home that is unsafe or suffocating, getting out of a life that has become unbearable, getting out of financial dependence, geographic isolation, or a social environment from which there appears to be no other exit. The partner, the person being married, is, in these cases, less a chosen companion and more a vehicle, a means of accessing a different life. The psychology of this pattern involves what clinicians describe as crisis-driven attachment, the formation of intense emotional bonds under conditions of threat or desperation. When you are in enough pain, when the need for escape is urgent enough, the person who offers a way out begins to seem not just useful, but essential, not just kind, but extraordinary, not just acceptable, but for a moment beloved. The emotion is real in the sense that it is being genuinely felt, but it is being generated by the circumstances, not the person. Remove the circumstances, and the feeling begins to change. People living this pattern often do not fully recognize it at the time. The relief of escape is so powerful, the sense of finally being free so intoxicating, that it resembles love closely enough to be mistaken for it. It is only later, once the escape has been made, once the crisis has passed, once the life they were running toward has become simply the life they live, that the distinction becomes visible. The partner is still there. The feeling that generated the bond is not. 6. low self-worth, and the limits of what you believe you deserve. This is one of the most painful patterns, and the one that tends to run deepest. It is built on a belief that most people who hold it would never consciously articulate, because consciously articulating it would require confronting it directly. The belief that you are not the kind of person who gets to have the love you want. That belief is almost never abstract. It has a history. It was built by years of being told in direct and indirect ways that you were too much or not enough, too emotional, not smart enough, too difficult, not attractive enough, too needy, not worthy of the investment. It was built by relationships in which you loved more than you were loved, by a family dynamic in which your needs were consistently deprioritized.
By the accumulated experience of wanting things and not getting them until the wanting itself began to feel dangerous, began to feel like a setup for disappointment, began to feel like something to be done away with. When self-worth is damaged in this way, the internal logic of partner selection changes. You stop asking what you want and start asking what you can get. The person you marry is not the person who made your world tilt on its axis. They are the person who seemed willing to stay. And staying, for someone who has never been sure they were worth staying for, carries a weight that overrides almost everything else. The tragedy of this pattern is its self-fulfilling quality. The person chooses a partner who doesn't fully meet them because they don't believe they deserve to be fully met. And the marriage, over time, confirms exactly the emotional flatness they settled for, which the wound that drove the choice then interprets as further evidence that this is simply what love looks like for someone like them. 7. The unconscious repetition of familiar pain. This is the deepest pattern, the most invisible, the one that operates most completely beneath the level of conscious awareness. And it begins with a paradox that seems, on the surface, to make no sense at all. Some people choose partners they don't love, not in spite of the fact that it will hurt them, but in some hidden structural way, because it will. The psychological mechanism here is what Freud originally called the repetition compulsion, and what contemporary attachment researchers have explored under the framework of internal working models, the deeply internalized templates for what relationships look and feel like, formed in early childhood, that the nervous system then uses as a map for navigating all future relationships. If the relationships that formed you were characterized by emotional unavailability, by love that was conditional, inconsistent, or withheld, your nervous system learned to associate love with a particular kind of anxiety, with the work of earning affection, with the low-grade distress of never being quite sure you were wanted. And because the nervous system is oriented toward the familiar rather than the pleasant, because what is known feels safe even when it is painful, you will tend to move toward relationships that reproduce that emotional texture, not because you want to suffer, but because that texture feels, in the most primal sense, like home. Choosing a partner you don't love, particularly one who is emotionally unavailable or who you sense will never fully choose you back, is, from this perspective, not a mistake. It is an unconscious accuracy, a perfect reproduction of the relational pattern the nervous system has come to regard as love. The feeling is not missing, it is just pointing at something from the past rather than someone in the present. Until the pattern itself is made visible, until the original wound is recognized for what it is, the marriage becomes one more iteration of the same story. A story that began long before this relationship, long before this choice, in a place and a time the person may not even remember. Now that you have moved through all 7 of these patterns, take a moment before you close this out, not to judge, not to diagnose anyone, but to sit with the possibility that some of what you just heard describes someone you know or describes something in yourself in a way that is worth staying with a little longer rather than moving past. The psychology of marrying without love is not a story about bad people making selfish choices. It is a story about people who were shaped by experiences they didn't choose, operating from beliefs they may have never examined, finding their way towards safety and survival in the only ways they knew how. The self-awareness that makes a different choice possible is not something everyone has equal access to, and recognizing that is not an excuse, but it is a starting point. If any of these patterns resonated with you, whether you are in a marriage, considering one, or reflecting on something that has already passed, consider sharing this with someone in your life who might need to hear it, not as a diagnosis, just as an opening. Sometimes the most important conversations begin not with what we say, but with what we are finally willing to name. If what we explored today stayed with you, particularly the patterns around self-worth, fear of abandonment, and the way childhood shapes the partners we choose, then there is a video I think you will want to watch next. It goes deeper into attachment theory and the specific ways that early relational wounds follow us into adult love, not as destiny, but as a pattern that once seen clearly can genuinely be changed. The link is on the screen now and in the description below. I think you will find that it answers some of the questions this one opened up. Thank you for watching this all the way through. Topics like this take a certain kind of courage to sit with, the willingness to look honestly at the invisible forces shaping the choices we make in love, and the fact that you stayed with it matters. If this video gave you something to think about, please hit the like button. It helps this kind of content reach the people who need it most, and I would genuinely love to hear from you in the comments. Of the 7 patterns we covered today, which one surprised you the most, and which one, if you were honest with yourself, felt closest to something you have seen in real life? There are no right answers, just real ones. If you want more content that goes beneath the surface of human behavior and the psychology of relationships, subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell. We go deep here, and I don't want you to miss what's coming next. I will see you in the next one.